Welcome and introduction to the case. Hey there. Thank you for joining me today on what, admittedly, is not the easiest journey to make. If you've ever found yourself lying awake at night, wondering how seemingly ordinary lives can suddenly be overtaken by horror, then this story will speak to that deep-seated fear. These are the kinds of tales that force us to confront uncomfortable truths about the world, and perhaps most painfully, about ourselves as a society. Today, I'm inviting you into a true crime case that has chilled not just a neighborhood or city, but an entire nation. There's a certain unease that comes from discussing real-life tragedies, and for good reason. Behind every headline or court report lies a shattered family and a lost future. Still, I believe that looking closely at these dark corners is the only way we can learn, mourn, and push for something better. Sometimes, the stories that haunt us most are the very ones that have the power to shift conversations and spark change. This episode is about compassion for the victims, righteous anger at the injustice suffered, and a sober look at the flaws in our institutions. The case I'm about to unfold is as heartbreaking as it is infuriating and, trust me, it will leave you questioning the systems meant to protect the most vulnerable among us. Here, we're not just telling a crime story. We're asking ourselves big, uncomfortable questions about responsibility, community, and what it truly means to protect a child. In the world of true crime, so many stories blur together, but some stand out, etched permanently into collective memory. Today's case is one of those, a layered tragedy that peels back the layers of a typical American family, only to reveal the unimaginable underneath. As we follow the facts, I hope you allow yourself to feel the heartbreak, the anger, and, dare I say, the hope for a world where cases like this no longer need to be told. Let's begin this difficult conversation with respect for the lives touched and a commitment to doing better by our children. Recalling a haunting American case. Before we delve too deeply into today's tragedy, let's take a moment to recall a case that once captured the nation's collective horror and heartbreak. A case that became a harsh symbol of institutional failure. If you've followed true crime in America, you might remember the devastating story of little Emily Parker. Emily was just 1 year old when she lost her life at the hands of her very own caretaker at a government-funded social welfare facility. The details of that case were broadcast everywhere, each one landing like a punch to the American conscience. Rage at the neglect and abuse committed by someone entrusted with the care of children swept through communities, and as the facts trickled out, they forced millions of Americans to confront the reality that even in a system designed to protect, cracks can form, and children can fall through them. Emily's story wasn't just a headline or a momentary topic of national conversation, it became a rallying cry for social workers, parents, lawmakers, and anyone who has ever cared about a child's well-being. The outpouring of grief was matched only by the anger and calls for reform. How could this happen in America? How many more Emilys were there hiding in plain sight, invisible behind bureaucracy and broken policies? The Parker case didn't merely break hearts, it galvanized change, at least for a while. Investigations were launched, finger-pointing began, and for a time people dared to hope that such a tragedy would never repeat itself. Unfortunately, history often reminds us that systemic change is slow, and the threats children face can take on new, cruel forms. Emily's legacy lingers in the background of any new child abuse case. She is in many ways the haunting reference point for future tragedies. Every time another innocent life is lost, her memory flickers through the headlines, reminding us of what's at stake and how much more we have left to do. The heartbreaking case in New York, 2006. The year was 2006, and the city that never sleeps, New York, was about to be shaken to its core. That spring, nestled in a working-class corner of Brooklyn, life trudged on in its hectic, unpredictable rhythm. Families struggled, children played on the stoops, neighbors traded gossip over steaming coffee, and the city pulsed with its characteristic buzz. Yet behind one apartment door, a quiet storm was brewing that would soon command the attention of millions across the nation. Sarah Bennett was just 12 years old, a girl with a quick wit, a love for comic books, and an easy smile that lit up any room she entered. She lived in a modest apartment with her mother Monica, a single parent juggling 2 jobs and barely making ends meet, and her younger brother Jamie, a precocious 7-year-old with an affinity for dinosaurs. Their building was the kind many New Yorkers know all too well, ancient radiators that clanged through the night, peeling paint, uneven wooden floors, and a makeshift community of tenants whose lives interconnected more out of necessity than fondness. Monica did her best, operating on less and less sleep each week, always hustling, her attention torn between overtime shifts and the constant worry that she couldn't quite be everywhere her kids needed her to be. And that, she'd later realize, was where the cracks started to appear. On the morning of June 5th, everything seemed normal. Sarah, responsible and mature beyond her years, helped Jamie find his sneakers and reminded her mom not to forget her lunch. That afternoon, Monica headed to her second job at a nearby diner, leaving the kids in the care of Elsa Rodriguez, their longtime babysitter who lived on the floor below, trusted, known, and most importantly, affordable. But at 6 p.m., routine dissolved into nightmare. Monica's phone rang relentlessly as she wiped down diner counters. First Elsa, then a neighbor, both frantic. Sarah was missing. She'd never returned from her usual after-school stroll to the corner market to buy comic books. At first, panic simmered just below the surface. Maybe Sarah was at the library. Maybe she'd stopped to help a friend. Yet with every minute that ticked by, the hope of a simple explanation faded. The search was instant and all-consuming. Within hours, the community became an army, plastering flyers, knocking on doors, flooding social media with pleas. NYPD detectives, hardened by years in the field, arrived on the scene, cordoning off the market, canvassing the surrounding streets, questioning anyone who might have seen the slightest trace of the missing girl. Helicopters hovered, search dogs combed alleyways and abandoned lots, news vans crowded curbs, and for a moment the city's relentless pace ground to a halt. The horror truly set in when officers discovered a piece of Sarah's backpack near an alley, followed by a few comic books, scattered as though she had clung to them until the very end. By the third day, news anchors were calling the case the city's newest heartbreak, stoking both fear and fury. Candlelight vigils sprang up citywide. Talk radio hosts debated safety, and city council members faced tough questions from parents shaken by the realization that if Sarah wasn't safe, maybe no child was. It wasn't long before suspicion landed uncomfortably close to home. Elsa Rodriguez's account of the afternoon changed with every retelling. Gripped by grief and denial, Monica didn't want to believe it, until evidence mounted, security footage showing Elsa following Sarah toward the market, and then returning, alone. The revelation detonated like a bombshell in the community. Betrayal, outrage, and devastation swirled together into one communal wound. Ultimately, Elsa confessed. Details emerged, raw, chilling, and unfathomable, about how trust so freely given had become the very instrument of tragedy. Sarah's life was cut short not by a stranger, but by someone she knew, in a building she called home, on a block meant to shelter her. The fallout washed across New York and the nation. New calls for vetting caregivers, stricter background checks, and funding for overburdened social services. Sarah's name would come to symbolize what could happen when vigilance slips if, even for a moment. For weeks the city stayed raw, a bit quieter, a lot sadder, and more aware of the fragility of everyday trust. Background and family circumstances of the victim. To truly grasp the gravity and heartbreak of this tragedy, it's crucial to pause and understand the family at its center, because stories like these are always more than headlines, police tapes, and courtroom drama. They begin in real homes, with real people, and in this case, with a family doing their best to hold things together in a city that can be both unforgiving and full of promise. Olivia was the light of her mother Linda's life, the kind of child whose laughter could brighten a tired soul after a long day, and whose compassionate heart was well beyond her 12 years. Linda, a Black American single mom, had weathered her fair share of storms. Having Olivia at just 19, she learned quickly what it meant to juggle motherhood, work, bills, and dreams for a better future. Her resilience was her armor, her love for her children, her driving force. Linda remarried some years later, tying her hopes to Mark, a man she believed would help create a stable, loving environment for her children. Mark brought a gentle demeanor at first, eager to gain Olivia's trust and play the role of a doting stepfather. From the outside, they blended in with the patchwork of working-class families crowding their Brooklyn apartment building, another brick in the city's sprawling mosaic. Sharing their small home was Ethan, Linda's son from Mark, a rambunctious 7-year-old with a wild imagination and a fierce devotion to his big sister. The family lived in one of the government-subsidized apartment complexes that dot New York, a world of humming radiators, thin walls, and neighbors who knew each other's routines by heart. While not poor by the bleakest standards, their day-to-day life was defined by careful budgeting, shared chores, and dreams that sometimes had to be put on hold. Linda worked 2 jobs, by day as a home health aide and by night at a grocery store, while Mark chipped in with odd construction gigs and periods of unemployment. What they lacked in luxury, they strove to make up in love, or at least Linda did. Family meals, simple but heartfelt, were non-negotiable. Birthdays were cherished, even if gifts were sometimes handmade or secondhand. Olivia helped care for Ethan, walked him to school, and became almost another adult in the household, keenly aware of her mother's sacrifices. Their bond, though occasionally strained by the pressures of the big city and adult worries, was unmistakable. Within this context, Olivia blossomed. She was academically gifted, adored by her teachers, and the friend everyone turned to for comfort or advice. Even in a neighborhood marked by struggle, Olivia's spirit stood out, a beacon of what could be possible when a child is loved, valued, and seen. Yet, as is too often true in stories like this, the same walls that kept danger out also hid secrets, stress, and shades of distrust, cracks in the facade that no one wanted to acknowledge until it was too late. Linda, for all her strength, could not be everywhere at once. Mark in time began to show signs of strain, frustration with long-term underemployment, unexplained mood swings, and subtle withdrawal from family activities. But in the swirl of daily survival, school, work, rent, doctor's appointments, these warning signs were easy to rationalize or overlook. This is the portrait of an American family, hopeful, imperfect, doing the best they can, and trusting that love and routine could keep their world intact. That is, until one ordinary day in May 2006, when the world they'd worked so hard to build was irreparably shattered. The tragedy begins. May 28, 2006, started like any ordinary Sunday in Brooklyn, warm, sticky air drifting through the open windows of government-subsidized apartment blocks while families settled into their weekend routines. But in Olivia's home, this day would become the dividing line. The before and after that, no one could have predicted. For Olivia's mother, Linda, and her stepfather, Mark, this weekend brought challenges no different from the hundreds that came before: torn work schedules, the eternal headache of odd jobs, and the juggling act that defined their modest life in the city. But what set this day apart, and what so many would come to scrutinize in agonizing detail, were the small decisions made almost automatically, trusted assumptions and casual goodbyes that, in hindsight, held tragic significance. It was the end of a long Memorial Day weekend. Linda, worn from 2 jobs and constant worry, had arranged with Mark, as she had so many times before, to bring the children to their grandmother's apartment, just a few subway stops away. This arrangement was their safety net, a family tradition meant to provide the children comfort, and the adults some respite from the relentless tide of bills and obligations. This evening, though, a last-minute shift change forced Linda into a late-night roster at the grocery store, and Mark agreed to pick up Olivia early to bring her home, letting her little brother Ethan stay overnight at Grandma's, where he'd be spoiled with extra dessert and bedtime stories. The streets glimmered with the ambient glow cast by corner bodegas and trailing headlights. Olivia was quiet on the subway heading home, clutching the latest library book she'd borrowed. Observant as ever, she picked up on her stepfather's taut silence but chalked it up to the fatigue that seemed to dog every grown-up she knew. When they arrived at their apartment, Mark went straight to the kitchen to reheat leftovers, while Olivia padded to her room, arranging her favorite dinosaur figurines on the bedside table, a ritual both comforting and mundane. Yet, tiny signals of unease flickered beneath the surface. Mark's demeanor was more abrupt than usual, and he seemed distracted, checking his phone and opening the window despite the humid air as though he needed oxygen. Olivia ate a few bites mechanically, more out of habit than hunger, before drifting to the bathroom to brush her teeth. There was nothing remarkable about these minutes, nothing that anyone looking back would immediately flag as alarming, but to a trained observer, even ordinary tension can be the tremor before the quake. As night deepened, the city's sounds faded to the distant hum of traffic. Mark insisted that Olivia turn in early, closing her bedroom door softly. He returned to the living room, the glow of the television dancing over empty couch cushions. What happened next was painstakingly pieced together later by police investigators and forensic psychologists, each step reconstructed through statements, timelines, and chillingly precise details. According to Mark's first statements, he said he checked on Olivia and found her asleep, then left to visit a neighbor for a smoke, locking the door behind him. But even in these initial recountings, contradictions lurked. Why would a stepfather leave a 12-year-old alone so late? And why did he take so long to return? When Linda arrived home from her night shift, she was struck by the eerie stillness in their small apartment. She expected to find Olivia asleep and Mark watching late-night sports, but something was off. The kitchen was immaculate, unusual given Mark's habit of leaving out dirty dishes. She called out softly, her voice wavering just so. No answer. When she gently opened Olivia's door, her daughter's absence collided with her worst maternal premonitions. The child she expected to see bundled under covers was simply gone. A frantic search began immediately, Linda tearing through the apartment, calling Olivia's name, Mark returning in a nervous rush, at least that's what he'd later claim, and a series of increasingly desperate calls made to neighbors and family. The night stretched on in a haze of panic. Every closet was scoured, every stairwell checked. Soon, the police were contacted, and their arrival signaled an escalation from parental fear to full-blown emergency. What followed was a jarring collision between the private despair of a family and the public machinery of a city's missing child protocol. The NYPD deployed officers across the neighborhood, canvassing for any sign of the girl. Volunteers, some strangers to the family, joined in surging patrols and late-night search parties. Social media soon bristled with, "Have you seen Olivia?" posts, her tender smile haunting digital timelines. The local deli owner replayed surveillance tapes for anxious detectives, neighbors opened their doors to officers, and the bleak possibility that harm had come to one of their own drew the tight-knit block closer than ever before. Linda's mental state during these hours vacillated between hope and terror, her mind replaying every recent moment with Olivia. Did her daughter seem worried? Had she mentioned anything odd? Was there something, anything, she'd missed? Mark, by contrast, alternated between mechanical helpfulness and a curiously flat affect that several neighbors would later report to police officers. Throughout the frantic early morning, he relayed details about Olivia's last known whereabouts, volunteered for searches, and appeared on local news reports, urging anyone with information to come forward. But inconsistencies in his version of events began to accumulate, quietly setting seasoned investigators on edge. Behind every detail that emerged was a growing certainty. The tragedy of that night hadn't merely disrupted the Bennett family, it had sent shockwaves of fear and suspicion through their entire community. The ordinary rituals of Sunday, family dinners, homework rushed through, bedtime stories, had in the space of a few silent hours transformed forever. People wondered aloud, how could such horror erupt from the fabric of daily life? How could a tragedy this profound start so quietly in a home so much like their own? Throughout the next day, Olivia's absence was officially classified as a missing persons case, and the neighborhood transformed into a staging ground for one of the most widespread child searches Brooklyn had conducted in recent years. Flyers with Olivia's photo were handed out in subway stations, local news trucks clustered at the edge of the family's apartment complex, and volunteers combed alleyways and rooftops for clues. Detectives pieced together fragments of the evening from contradictory statements, phone records, and odd gaps in the time Mark said he was gone. Canvassing the apartment building yielded little, no forced entry, no obvious signs of struggle. Yet as forensic investigators scoured the household, their attention was drawn to small but telling things: a hastily wiped surface, a set of damning fingerprints, and a faint trace of Olivia's favorite body spray clinging to a jacket that shouldn't have been there. The puzzle took a shape more sinister than a simple disappearance. By the time dusk settled the following night and Olivia still hadn't returned, hope began to fray. Neighbors grew tense, their whispers shifting from supportive encouragement to worried speculation about the possibility of foul play lurking much closer to home than any of them dare admit. The final hours. Even the longest and most heartbreaking nights must begin with something seemingly ordinary: a sound, a glance, a half-spoken word around a dim-lit apartment. For Olivia and her family, the final hours before her disappearance unfolded against the familiar backdrop of their Brooklyn home, where the persistent sigh of traffic from the street below mingled with the soft hum of appliances and the uneven rhythm of old radiators. Linda's anticipation of returning home after a grueling shift was met, instead, by the unsettling silence that had settled like a shroud over the apartment. Every mother knows the cadence of her family's normal: the gentle rustling of sheets from a child's restless sleep, the distant giggle of a sibling, the reassuring voice of a partner lost in mundane activity. But that night, such sounds were absent, replaced by an eerie vacuum that pitted Linda's heart against her mind's wildest fears. It is one of the many cruelties of tragedy. It so often disguises itself at first as merely a ripple in routine. Mark, by all outside accounts, acted as a parent might, checking on Olivia before heading momentarily out. But unlike so many other nights, nothing returned to equilibrium. The patterns of protection and trust that had been practiced for years now revealed themselves as terribly vulnerable to collapse. Around midnight, Linda began to pace. She stopped outside Olivia's room for minutes at a time, straining for any sign of breath or stirring. She silently chastised herself for feeling anxious. Surely her daughter had simply fallen into a deep sleep before another school week. Yet, when she finally opened the door, what greeted her was not the precious sight of a safely sleeping child, but an empty bed, the covers still creased with the impression of Olivia's small frame, and the bedside lamp flickering uncertainly. Olivia's favorite dinosaur figurines were lined up by her pillow, just as always, a tranquil tableau interrupted only by her inexplicable absence. As the minutes ticked painfully by, Linda's worry crystallized into raw terror. She searched high and low, her movements frantic, logic rapidly unraveling under the weight of dread. She phoned Mark first, her voice trembling, half angry, half pleading. Mark's response was oddly flat. He seemed tired, distracted, oddly emotionless. He claimed he'd just left her asleep, that perhaps she'd wandered to visit a neighbor, or found her way downstairs to retrieve something forgotten. These were not impossibilities, Linda told herself, but her instincts screamed that something was deeply wrong. The neighbors, intimately familiar with each other's routines, had nothing to offer when Linda knocked at their doors. No one had seen Olivia since Mark and the girl entered the apartment that evening. The old elevator, a perpetual source of gossip and complaint, offered neither sightings nor clues. Panic mounted as Linda's calls to Olivia's small, prepaid phone went unanswered, each ring punctuating the terrible distance growing between hope and horror. Mark returned after about an hour, appearing agitated but poorly disguised. He made a show of joining Linda in her desperate search but never quite looked her in the eye. His recounting of the night wavered. One moment he'd left Olivia reading in bed before stepping out for a smoke, and another he insisted she'd been tucked in and sound asleep. The shifting details, combined with his lack of urgency, gnawed at Linda's soul. When the police finally arrived, called by Linda after her own resolve was exhausted, the household became the epicenter of tension and mounting fear. The officers moved with measured professionalism, asking questions, jotting down notes, reassuring the family with protocols that did little to suppress the terror that now thrummed in Linda's chest. Every room was inspected, every closet opened, while a small circle of neighbors gathered anxiously outside, whispering theories and scapegoats into the hot summer night. Detectives paid special attention to the slight disorder in Olivia's room and the strange arrangement of personal items. There were no obvious signs of struggle, but something felt palpably off. A hastily folded sweatshirt out of place, a faint scent of body spray not usually present, a second set of footprints distinct in the hallway carpet. All minor details individually, but together they formed a tapestry of unease for even the most seasoned investigators. The television, left on in the living room, cast uneasy shadows against the walls while flickering news anchors described events elsewhere, oblivious to the tragedy silently unfurling in this very apartment. Linda's mind, exhausted but unwilling to surrender to despair, cycled through every permutation of possibility. Could Olivia have been sleepwalking? Was she hiding, angry about some trivial disagreement from earlier in the day? It seemed increasingly impossible. The apartment, usually a space for comfort and chaos alike, now felt cavernous and unbearably hollow. Mark's behavior grew more suspicious as the hours wore on. Asked repeatedly about his actions between leaving and returning home, his answers became defensive, even hostile. For every question he produced a new, minute adjustment to his initial story, distracting from the central horror that Olivia was missing, and no plausible scenario explained it. The police, registering these inconsistencies, pressed harder, but their tone remained careful, wary of further distressing a family already dashed against the rocks of their worst nightmare. As dawn approached, fatigue gave way to bleak resignation, and then to the mobilizing force of despair. Officers fanned out through the building, knocking on every door, flashing their badges to wary night owls and tossing rapid-fire questions that, for most, yielded only confusion or pity. Flyers were drafted and printed by the dozen, with Olivia's smiling photograph, now the centerpiece of a community's urgent plea. Outside, the city itself seemed to pause. Even traffic noise muted its usual din, lending the small crisis inside the apartment a gravitas that strained the heartbeats of everyone nearby. Inside, Linda's resolve fractured. She sobbed openly for the first time, clutching one of Olivia's sweatshirts and breathing in her daughter's fading scent. She alternated between pleading aloud for her child to be returned and cursing herself for every decision, all the while haunted by the feeling that she had missed some crucial warning, some small sign lost amid the relentless grind of daily survival. In a world that often refuses to slow down for private tragedy, this family's agony now absorbed the full attention of an entire precinct. The final hours were a mesh of heightened emotion, bureaucratic necessity, and the dull ache of time slipping by without resolution. The sun's first light through soiled window panes promised nothing except more of the same: questions, uncertainty, and a household forever altered. Mark, isolated in the kitchen, called his own relatives with a strained voice, often speaking in half-whispers. He uttered assurances to Linda and the officers alike, but his presence radiated the raw discomfort of someone with too much to hide. Detectives finally asked Mark to travel to the precinct, a procedure they framed as routine. His agreement was hesitant, but he complied, offering only cursory goodbyes and a flat acceptance of their instructions. As Linda watched him go, her exhaustion collapsed into a numbness so deep it bordered on catatonia. The moments that followed were filled with a grim choreography. Forensics teams arrived to dust for fingerprints, check for signs of forced entry, and compile lists of everyone who had entered or exited the apartment in the past 12 hours. Ethan, wide-eyed and tearless, sat bundled in an officer's jacket, watched over by a gentle-voiced policewoman. The routine of investigation offered a false sense of direction to everyone except Linda, who knew, with the surety that only mothers possess, that the answer lay somewhere between what was said and what was left unsaid by the man she had come to trust. The sorrow of these final hours settled uneasily into every object and every memory that filled the apartment. Sunlight streaked the floors where Olivia had played just the afternoon before. A breakfast bowl, never cleared away, became a bleak artifact, a reminder that grief so often attaches itself to the mundane. The community too mourned in their own way. A neighbor left a small bunch of wilted flowers near the elevator door, another lit a candle and whispered a prayer. There would be days, weeks, of searching, revelation, and heartache to come. But in these final moments before the rest of the world learned Olivia's name, a mother's grief, a community's dread, and a hidden truth lingered in the heavy air, promising that nothing would ever again be as it was before that one unassuming night in Brooklyn. Police reporting and search operation. In the hours immediately after Olivia's disappearance, the world seemed to collapse in slow motion for her mother, Linda. Panic turned to action. Linda's shaking hands dialed 911, her voice barely holding steady as she relayed the nightmare that had upended her home. The New York Police Department responded swiftly, dispatching patrol cars to the Brooklyn apartment complex. The initial police report described a missing child with no visible signs of forced entry or struggle, a detail that, for detectives, signaled both a mystery and a potential urgency for action. As the first officers arrived on scene, their professionalism brought order to the chaos. They swept through the family's apartment, flashlights probing every shadow, radios crackling with updates. The lead investigator, Detective Morales, methodically walked through the timeline with Linda and Mark, recording last known whereabouts, Olivia's attire, and any patterns or habits that might inform the search. His experience in missing children cases made the buzzing anxiety in the room tolerable but not easy. Every moment wasted, he knew, meant the odds of finding Olivia diminished. Word spread through the building quickly. In the city that never sleeps, a missing child cut through daily rhythms and rivaled breaking news. Linda's neighbors, many of whom had seen Olivia grow from a toddler into the bright, caring preteen she'd become, formed the first circle of civilian responders. They combed stairwells and laundry rooms, pounded on doors, and called out Olivia's name into the thick summer night. Someone phoned the building's security company to pull surveillance footage. Others hurried to local delis and bodegas asking if anyone had seen the girl. Meanwhile, Mark threw himself into the search with outward energy, though some found his behavior oddly forced. He printed out the clearest, most recent photo of Olivia and walked each block in the neighborhood, taping flyers to bus shelters, lampposts, and the walls outside corner stores. "Missing! Olivia Johnson, 12 years old!" The bright black lettering screamed from the page, her hopeful smile captured forever in grainy pixels. The community response grew exponentially in the coming hours. Neighbors with cars offered to drive the streets in search grids as outlined by NYPD. Local church groups formed prayer circles, holding vigil on the cracked sidewalks under flickering street lamps. Those who didn't know the family personally shared posts online, tagging citywide parent forums and local news stations. By early morning, Olivia's disappearance was being discussed on every radio show and morning newscast across the 5 boroughs. Brooklyn, a borough built on resilience and close-knit ties, activated its own informal but formidable search network. At the police precinct, Detective Morales and his team got to work mapping out a plan using every available resource. NYPD's Missing Persons Unit coordinated with the city's Amber Alert system, preparing a regional broadcast that would go live if Olivia wasn't found within several hours. The officers, well versed in the urgency of these situations, divided tasks. One team canvassed the apartment complex and its surroundings, focusing on the most likely escape routes, rooftops, and basements. Another officer typed up a formal missing child report, uploading Olivia's details and photograph into national and state databases accessed by law enforcement agencies across the country. Others reached out to the Metropolitan Transit Authority to check if Olivia had boarded any city buses or subways, since the family lived close to several major lines. Linda, numb with worry, oscillated between hope and devastating realizations. She answered questions about Olivia's friends, habits, and recent emotional states. Had Olivia seemed afraid of anyone? Had there been any trouble at school? Did she ever talk about running away? The weight of each question lingered in the air, another stone added to the load Linda was forced to carry. Meanwhile, Mark gave his version of events, careful to appear helpful but dodging eye contact and rushing through his timeline. Within hours, the search was citywide. Police set up a mobile command center outside the apartment building. Unmarked detective cars joined the keyed-up patrol units. Media crews began arriving with camera equipment and microphones, desperate for sound bites in the swelling heat of breaking news. Reporters peppered officers and the family alike with questions, sometimes insensitive, often frantic. More than just a law enforcement effort, this became a citywide mobilization. Volunteers printed thousands of flyers. Taxi drivers monitored their radios for updates. Even local businesses posted signs in their windows, and every parent in the area held their child a little closer that night, haunted by the possibility that the unthinkable could strike anywhere, anytime. As daylight broke across Brooklyn, the scope of the investigation deepened. Canvassing teams, composed of both officers and volunteers, methodically worked through public parks, schoolyards, playgrounds, and alleyways. Trained bloodhounds were brought in, sniffing for Olivia's scent from personal items Linda provided, a sweatshirt, a scrunchie, and a much-loved book from her bedside. Their handlers conferred quietly with police when the dogs flagged potential trails, hopes rising and falling with every street crossed and every yard searched. The apartment complex, usually a hub of small joys and private squabbles, now became an epicenter of worry. The building's superintendent unlocked storage spaces and utility rooms, sometimes in the presence of stern NYPD officers. Maintenance workers helped check boiler rooms and secluded corners. Residents, many first-generation immigrants from the Caribbean, West Africa, and South America, banded together regardless of language or religion, united by horror and empathy. Some elders offered words of comfort, while teens organized chain texts and translated the flurry of police instructions into Spanish, Haitian Creole, or Yoruba. Behind the scenes, the detectives worked tirelessly. Surveillance footage from streets and building lobbies was reviewed, sometimes frame by frame. Detectives went door to door asking if anyone had noticed unfamiliar vehicles or strangers in the area. Several tips came in from the tip line, each one treated seriously. Even outlandish claims were logged, followed up, and ultimately ruled out if no evidence supported them. All the while, time grew heavier. Each hour that passed without a breakthrough increased the sense of desperation. For Linda, the agony was relentless. She recalled every moment leading up to that night, second-guessing herself. Had she locked the door tightly enough? Should she have trusted Mark? Friends and distant family members arrived, some bringing food or just a shoulder to cry on. The apartment brimmed with visitors but felt emptier than ever. The only thing that pierced Linda's days was Ethan's small hand clutching hers, his face pale and confused, asking when his sister would come home. By afternoon, the citywide search became even more structured. NYPD issued a formal Amber Alert, pushing Olivia's photo and a brief description to phones, highway billboards, and television tickers across New York State. The Amber Alert hotline received dozens of tips, a mixture of hopeful sightings and well-intentioned mistakes, but each one pulled precious resources into action. Outdoor search crews marked off sections of Prospect Park and searched beneath overpasses, while scuba specialists checked drainage ditches and nearby waterways as a grim precaution. NYPD's community liaison officers met with local leaders to coordinate support for the family and keep the community informed. Local pastors and counselors offered emotional guidance at a makeshift support center organized in the basement of the nearest church. School administrators posted updates on the district website and prepared for the return of frightened students who knew Olivia as a classmate and friend. In group text chats, parents swapped rumors, fact-checked police updates, and painstakingly mapped out possible locations for new search groups. That evening, City Hall and the mayor's office contacted Linda personally, promising every available resource to assist in finding her daughter. The mayor released a statement assuring the public that the city would leave no stone unturned, and the story led every major news broadcast in the region. Social media became a launchpad for digital search parties. Posts tagged #FindOlivia spread across Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, with thousands of shares and messages of hope and solidarity streaming in from every corner of the country. The intense public interest brought additional complexities. Some neighbors criticized the media's invasion of privacy, or resented reporters hounding Linda and Ethan for comments. Others questioned the pace of the investigation, or suspected the family of not telling the full truth, feeding whispers and speculative suspicion that often run through communities in the shadow of tragedy. Throughout the following night and into the next morning, law enforcement ramped up their efforts, working in coordinated shifts to maintain a round-the-clock search. Larger search parties fanned out into neighboring districts. Drone teams scanned rooftops and empty lots using infrared cameras, while mounted police on horseback checked areas inaccessible by car. The city's river patrol assisted by scouring the East River banks and inlet coves nearby, ever watchful for any sign of the missing girl. At Ground Zero, the apartment complex took on a new rhythm, a marching beat fueled by anxiety and the sharp edge of hope. Donation drives blossomed, with residents donating bottled water, flashlights, and even battery chargers for the volunteers and police officers. Store owners brought free coffee and sandwiches for the search crews, and children drew homemade posters with Olivia's name, taping them on mailboxes and bus benches. The neighborhood's collective heartbeat was audibly faster, unified in single-minded determination to bring Olivia home. As Detective Morales coordinated an evening debrief with his officers, he acknowledged the strain on both professionals and community members alike. Some leads were already exhausted, evidence bags labeled and stored for forensic analysis. Others, like interviews with Mark and Linda, would soon need to be revisited in exhaustive detail. A sense of unease grew with each dead end, rational doubts clashing with the desperate wish for a miracle outcome. For Linda, these days blurred into one long, anxious vigil. She rarely slept, kept awake by grief and responsibility, sitting by the window with her phone in hand. Each ring brought new dread, false tips, updates from overworked detectives, and calls from distant relatives sending prayers. Through it all, she clung to hope that the city's massive mobilization would yield answers and that somehow her daughter would be found safe. But as the sun rose yet again, the realization settled deeper with every shadow cast across Olivia's empty room. The truth revealed. The villain exposed. The truth, when it finally surfaced, spread through Brooklyn like a shockwave, unexpected, violent in its impact, and impossible to take back. In the frenzied aftermath of Olivia's disappearance, the neighborhood had become a hive of coordinated chaos. Search parties, prayer circles, late-night interviews with detectives, and media crews camped beneath flickering street lamps. But behind every theory, every whispered hope or accusation, the real answer had always sat much closer than anyone wanted to admit. Detective Morales, the lead investigator, was exhausted when the call came in. It was late, well past midnight. His team scattered in the field, their nerves stretched by dead ends and missed leads. At the station, Mark had become increasingly agitated. Where he once presented as a pillar of support, his mask of concern began to slip. He fidgeted during questioning, contradicted himself with small details, and asked, strangely often, about the timing and extent of police searches in various city sectors. Morales, seasoned by years of similar interviews, sensed a shift. The performance was failing, and under it, something deeply fractured was beginning to show. It wasn't a singular moment that cracked Mark's composure. It was the accumulation of pressure, and the slow, relentless chipping away by investigators who refused to let any detail pass unchecked. While Mark sat in the interview room, a gray space lit by a single humming fixture overhead, a team of forensic techs were quietly processing evidence collected from the family apartment and nearby streets. DNA swabs, fiber comparisons, and the persistent sifting of hours of grainy surveillance footage all converged, to form a web far tighter than any witness account could create. The break came in the form of a partial shoe print, one with a worn, recognizable pattern matching the sneakers Mark had worn on the night of Olivia's disappearance. The print had been recovered from a patch of earth beneath an overpass less than a mile from the apartment complex, an isolated strip of concrete and wild thistles where few Brooklyn residents ventured, especially after dark. Alongside the print, techs had uncovered fibers consistent with Olivia's clothing and a single heartbreakingly familiar hair tie, red with a little stitched butterfly no more than a child's thumbnail in size. Faced with the mounting evidence, Mark's resolve collapsed. As dawn colored the city in muted blues and golds, he finally admitted what, on some deeply human level, Linda, Ethan, and perhaps even Detective Morales had begun to fear. His confession was not loud or dramatic, it came out in a monotonous whisper, the words punctuated by long stretches of silence and an overwhelming sense of defeat. He admitted to being present at the overpass, having taken Olivia there under the pretense of a walk to clear the air after an argument about going back to her grandmother's place. Mark insisted it had never been planned, that some sudden overwhelming mix of anger, exhaustion, and shame blurred his intent and triggered a chain of violence from which he could not retreat. The grim task of recovering Olivia's remains fell to forensic teams who approached the area with reverence, aware that every step disturbed ground now sacred by grief. The overpass, surrounded by wild grass and wind-littered debris, was cordoned off at sunrise. Police painstakingly mapped every inch, searching not only for forensic clues but also for any slim chance that part of this nightmare was a mistake and Olivia would be found alive. Hope had by then become ritual, a steadfast denial of the truth now written in Mark's exhausted confession. The official cause of death would later be listed as drowning, but the autopsy revealed recent bruising and abrasions. There were defensive wounds as well, a terrible testament to Olivia's final moments, her refusal to surrender, even as trust crumbled into betrayal. Experts debated whether the tragedy was impulsive or premeditated, but the distinction was cold comfort to a mother haunted nightly by what-ifs. Linda refused at first to accept Mark's guilt, insisting there must be a deeper explanation, mental illness, an accident, some unspeakable provocation. The city's social workers and counselors filled her days and Ethan's with sessions meant to guide healing, but Brooklyn's wider community was less forgiving. Public outrage was immediate and unrelenting. News outlets published Mark's mugshot alongside images of lit candles and stuffed toys amassed at makeshift memorials around the apartment complex. Opinion pieces railed against systemic failures, pointing to the lack of consistent background checks for adults in blended families, the need for expanded mental health resources, and the isolation that often infects urban households pressed to their limits. Children who'd played with Olivia struggled to make sense of the loss, asking teachers and parents questions for which there were no gentle answers. Ethan, sheltered as much as possible from the media spectacle, clung to his mother in bewildered silence. Linda withdrew from work, relying on friends, church connections, and support groups, her apartment filled with bouquets and meals, but never quite enough comfort. Meanwhile, the NYPD faced an onslaught of criticism. Why hadn't Mark been suspected sooner? Should they have interpreted his inconsistencies as red flags rather than natural side effects of trauma? Were there missed opportunities, a phone tip, a surveillance tape not reviewed in time, that could have altered the outcome? These questions flooded radio call-in shows and city council forums for months. When Mark was formally charged, the courtroom overflowed with press and local residents, all hungry for closure if not justice. His demeanor at arraignment was blank, his once defensive posture reduced to vacant resignation. The prosecution painted him as manipulative and violent. The defense, in a move that divided public opinion, pointed to economic desperation, psychological distress, and the grind of social isolation. Through it all, Linda testified with simmering grief, and eventually, steely clarity. Her voice speaking not only for Olivia, but for every child who'd ever been failed by the adults meant to protect them. In the end, the unmasking of Mark was not a neat conclusion. There was no redemption, no sudden insight to explain the unexplainable. What lingered, instead, was a deep ache, as neighbors reckoned with the chasm between the ordinary man they thought they knew and the horrifying reality he concealed. In school assemblies, community forums, and whispered nighttime prayers, Olivia became a symbol, a call to vigilance, to honesty, and to a collective promise that such a tragedy must never come so close to home again. Overview of investigation and community response. The revelation of the perpetrator behind Olivia's disappearance and tragic death sent shockwaves throughout the Brooklyn neighborhood and far beyond. In the days and weeks that followed, the investigation became not only a story of police procedure, but also a deep reflection of the pain and anger pulsing through the local community. This was no longer just a case within the walls of an apartment complex, it was a matter of public conscience where anxieties, grief, and calls for justice collided in vivid and deeply human ways. From the outset, the NYPD was under tremendous public scrutiny. The moment Mark's involvement was confirmed, the media spotlight intensified, and so did the pressure on detectives to both explain the timeline and justify investigatory choices. Community meetings erupted in courthouse basements and school gyms, filled with residents demanding answers and accountability. Why had warning signs gone unheeded? Were protocols for identifying at-risk children really sufficient? Each fraught question echoed not only on the local news but also in classrooms, workplaces, and countless homes where parents now held their children a little closer. A visible rift quickly grew in the community's emotional landscape. On one side stood an overwhelming wave of sorrow and empathy, for Olivia's family, for her mother Linda and little brother Ethan in particular, and for the innocents lost in a place once considered safe. Local organizations and faith leaders held candlelight vigils, with the area around the apartment building transformed into a memorial of flowers, heartfelt notes, and rows of stuffed animals lining the courtyard fence. Volunteers rotated shifts to keep the displays tidy, occasionally lighting candles anew in silent promise that Olivia would never be forgotten. On the other side, waves of outrage crested and crashed as the details of the investigation and the failure of intervention came to light. Mark had moved through the community as a father and neighbor, rarely drawing attention, but now every interaction was viewed through a lens of suspicion and regret. Strategically placed posters advocating for more robust background checks in blended families sprang up on street lamps and community bulletin boards. Social workers were besieged with new requests from parents looking to learn warning signs and secure their households better. It seemed as if every local family was suddenly reviewing its own foundations for unseen cracks. The investigation itself, meanwhile, was dissected in real time by the crowd of journalists camped outside precinct headquarters. Press conferences led by Detective Morales became daily rituals. He fielded pointed questions about the speed of the initial response, the interpretation of forensic evidence, and how the police had handled Mark in the crucial hours before his confession. Critics raised the issue of implicit biases, pointing out that families of color in neighborhoods like Brooklyn's often felt either over-policed or overlooked, with neither approach leading to genuine trust or safety. Editorials debated whether bureaucracy and a lack of interagency communication had contributed to delays or missteps in the investigative process. It was not only law enforcement under scrutiny. Child welfare agencies faced urgent public questioning. Advocates highlighted the inherent vulnerabilities in families struggling under economic stress, navigating the challenges of blended households, or contending with spotty access to mental health care. The city's hotline for child welfare tips saw a surge in calls, some reporting legitimate concern, others driven by panic or rumor. Social service staff worked around the clock to deal with a flood of worried parents and caregivers who now feared for their children in ways they never had before. Olivia's school became a focal point for collective mourning and activism. Teachers organized a remembrance assembly. Her classmates, some too young to truly grasp the immensity of the tragedy, drew cards and chalked messages of love and loss on the playground. Crisis counselors were stationed on campus for weeks, providing support to both students and staff, many of whom felt the impact of the loss rippling through every classroom and hallway. The local school board, facing tough questions from parents at heated public meetings, launched an internal review of its own practices regarding student safety and after-school procedures. Faith-based organizations, advocacy groups, and even local politicians vied to lead the conversation toward hope and reform. Prayer vigils gave way to town hall meetings where activists demanded legislative change, mandatory background checks for adults in all domestic settings, better resources for single-parent families, expanded mental health outreach, and school-based educational campaigns about signs of domestic unrest. The language of reform became part of everyday conversations, with families debating the merits and drawbacks of potential new laws over kitchen tables and in grocery store checkout lines. Media coverage, sometimes compassionate, sometimes intrusive, fanned the flames of public debate. News outlets spotlighted not just the tragedy but the broader failings of a system meant to protect its most vulnerable. Panel discussions on local television featured experts in law, psychology, and social work, all parsing out what could and should have been done differently. On social media, strangers thousands of miles away voiced sympathy and outrage in equal measure, sending messages of support to Olivia's family and demanding justice for her loss. In the aftermath, lawsuits were filed, investigations into city agency conduct were launched, and task forces convened to review everything from missing child protocols to the adequacy of funding for community outreach. The district attorney promised transparent prosecution, while public defenders pushed for increased attention to mental health resources, not just for perpetrators, but for families and survivors as well. Yet amid the turbulence, small moments of genuine connection and healing quietly looked for footing. Linda, though devastated, found unlikely allies in neighbors who brought meals, offered childcare for Ethan, and even just sat with her in stillness. Local artists painted a mural of Olivia, a sea of local children's faces behind her to symbolize unity and hope. Annual memorial walks were proposed, with the stated goal of both honoring her memory and maintaining pressure on local leaders to enact meaningful change. Looking back, the community's reaction to the tragedy revealed deep-seated anxieties about the fault lines that can run unseen beneath the surface of American life, especially in neighborhoods navigating challenges of poverty, racial tension, and rapid social change. But it also underscored a collective capacity for resilience, for remaking grief into a call to action, for refusing to allow Olivia's story to fade in silence, and for forging connections even in the aftermath of loss. The investigation, though ultimately successful in securing justice for Olivia, became a symbol of both the possibilities and limitations of institutional response. Every law enforcement debrief, every school policy written, and every community conversation held after Olivia's death served as a reminder. Too late for her, but critical for others. Hopes for a safer future now rested on the willingness of individuals and systems alike to heed the lessons, to act sooner and listen closer the next time danger threatened to emerge unseen behind closed doors. In the end, Olivia's memory remained a point of light in the Brooklyn neighborhood, a reason for parents to check in on their children just one more time at night, for local organizations to keep advocating for child safety, and for a grieving city to remember that vigilance, compassion, and community are often the strongest defenses against the repeat of such tragedy. Testimonies and courtroom drama. The trial was set to be one of the most watched and emotionally charged legal proceedings Brooklyn had seen in years, a simmering cocktail of grief, justice, and public outrage. From the moment Mark was led into the courthouse in handcuffs, pale and withdrawn under the fluorescent glare of waiting cameras, the air was thick with anticipation. Every day, lines of reporters and ordinary citizens snaked around the block, some desperate to witness history, others seeking a kind of reckoning or closure for a communal wound that refused to heal. The prosecution came out swinging. Their opening statement was cascading with emotion and evidence. They painted Mark as a manipulator, a man who breached the greatest trust of all, between parent and child. The lead attorney, Assistant District Attorney Sophia Tran, spared no rhetoric, laying bare the sequence of events pieced together from forensic reports, witness statements, and Mark's own shifting confessions. She described the hours Olivia was last seen, each contradiction in Mark's timeline, and the mounting physical evidence that told a story of betrayal and violence. More than anything, she looked straight at the jury, reminding them that at the heart of the trial was the silenced voice of a young girl. Not a day went by that Olivia's memory was not evoked. Her school portrait and favorite dinosaur figurine were displayed in the evidence slideshow on the first day, drawing tears and gasps from many in the audience. When it was the defense's turn, they didn't try to paint Mark as blameless. Instead, public defender Alan Green asked the jury to view him with the full weight of his flawed humanity. The defense's opening statement was quieter, colored by details of mental health struggles, crushing financial stress, and the challenges Mark faced as a stepfather in a complex blended household. Green asked whether a single moment of irreversible rage should define a man forever, and cautioned against letting public anger cloud the search for truth. Their strategy was not to deny the physical evidence, but to humanize Mark and cast his actions as the tragic end of years of quietly building strain, the explosive result of untreated trauma and poverty. First to take the witness stand was Linda, Olivia's mother. Her testimony was the emotional core of the trial. She spoke with a mother's raw ache, voice quivering but unwavering as she recounted their life together, their struggles, dreams, and the ordinary joys Olivia brought into their home. Linda described the night of the disappearance, her exhaustion, the mounting panic, Mark's fluctuating moods, and the gut-wrenching moment she realized Olivia was gone. At one point she broke down while recounting the last text she had sent her daughter. "Let me know when you and Mark get home. Love you so much." Many in the courtroom wept quietly, some scribbling notes, others just staring at the floor. Under cross-examination, the defense sought to gently probe for cracks. They asked Linda about any prior tensions in the household, her own doubts, and Mark's role as a parent. The defense brought up the family's financial instability, the pressure of raising children in a city that seemed to offer little mercy, and even moments where Linda had leaned on Mark for support. Linda's responses were mostly resolute, but moments of hesitancy revealed the impossible position she was in, mourning her daughter, grappling with betrayal, and still trying to make sense of the past. The prosecution called forensic specialists who testified in detail about the evidence found. The partial shoe print, the red butterfly hair tie, the trace fibers matched to Olivia's pajamas, and the signs of struggle detectable only through painstaking lab work. They reconstructed the likely chain of events with chilling clarity, demonstrating that the timing, nature, and location of the evidence contradicted Mark's version of accidental harm. Graphics and 3D models were displayed on a projection screen for the jury, offering a step-by-step account of the crime scene. Equally harrowing was the testimony of the lead detective, Detective Morales, whose methodical investigation had pieced together the narrative. He described long hours spent reviewing surveillance footage, tracking down witnesses, and the moment Mark's story began to unravel. Morales also addressed the criticism leveled at NYPD for not treating Mark as a suspect sooner, expressing a mixture of professional regret and the hard realities of navigating child disappearance cases where time is always the enemy. A pivotal turning point in the proceedings came when the prosecution played a recording of Mark's confession. It was neither dramatic nor defiant. If anything, it was marked by defeated monotony, with long silences and vague statements about snapping and feeling trapped. The jury sat frozen as Mark's own words, flat and drained of affect, described the events of that night. Occasionally his voice would catch. "I don't remember everything. I just know I couldn't take it anymore," he said. The prosecution followed up with an expert on trauma and memory, who explained why perpetrators sometimes offer fragmented or contradictory explanations, not out of malice, but because of shame, and the mind's attempt to distance itself from horror. Still, the defense leaned on Mark's background and psychological state. They called to the stand a psychologist who detailed his history of depression, anxiety, and unresolved childhood trauma. Neighbors and co-workers took the stand to testify about instances in which Mark seemed kind, helpful, and loyal, a man who, until the fateful night, had never shown violence. The jury was left to ponder. Could someone truly snap with no warning? Or had the seeds of violence been quietly growing beneath the surface all along? Courtroom dynamics were taut. At times, shouts erupted as spectators reacted to revelations, and the judge had to remind those present to respect the process, no matter how charged. Law students scribbled notes in the back, family members clutched tissues. Social workers and child advocates from Brooklyn and beyond attended every day, seeking lessons and hoping that Olivia's case would provoke real reform. Nationwide, television segments and op-eds debated every development. Outside the courthouse, protesters and sympathizers with signs, some attacking Mark, others calling for prison reform and more mental health resources, clashed verbally, kept apart by a line of NYPD officers. Even in the jury room, tension was palpable. Deliberations lasted 3 days, as jurors grappled with the legal definitions of intent, the emotional toll of the crime, and what justice should look like for both Olivia and her broken family. In the end, the trial was not simply a quest for punishment but a communal confrontation with the hardest truths. The ways family structure can hide violence, the dangers of stigma and isolation, and the gutting failure of safety nets meant to protect children. When the verdict was finally announced, silence fell over the courtroom, a silence weighted with the knowledge that no sentence, no matter how severe, could restore what had been lost. Linda sobbed quietly as the decision was read, the memory of Olivia a living presence in every heart and every trembling voice that filled the Brooklyn courthouse that day. The verdict, consequences, and painful truth. The tension in the Brooklyn courthouse, built up over weeks of testimony and cross-examination, finally reached its peak as the formal sentencing of Mark Johnson approached. The anticipation was nearly unbearable, not only for Linda and the remnants of Olivia's devastated family, but for an entire community left reeling by a crime that struck at the very core of trust and safety. As the judge entered and the room fell silent, every person in attendance seemed to hold their breath, desperate for clarity, for justice, for some affirmation that the system could answer the magnitude of what was lost. Mark's sentencing hearing began with the prosecution reiterating the full measure of what had happened. Assistant District Attorney Sophia Tran reminded the court that Olivia was not merely a victim, but a daughter, a friend, an irreplaceable member of a family and a community. She spoke about the details of the crime and the irreparable harm done to Olivia's loved ones, emphasizing the need for accountability and the broader message that such evil could not and would not go unpunished. Bolstered by letters from grieving community members and statements from Olivia's teachers and classmates, the prosecution called for the maximum sentence allowed under New York state law, asserting that Mark's actions were deliberate, unforgivable, and required the harshest response. The defense, in turn, appealed for a modicum of mercy. Public Defender Alan Green did not deny Mark's role in the tragedy. There was no way to dispute the mountain of forensic evidence and Mark's own confession. Instead, Green painted a picture of a man broken by years of financial difficulty, mental health struggles, and social isolation. Citing medical records and psychological evaluations, the defense argued that Mark was not an evil man, but a deeply troubled individual who had failed to seek help before it was too late. Green questioned whether society itself bore some responsibility for not providing adequate support or intervention, and whether lifelong punishment would bring any more healing to Olivia's family. He pleaded with the judge to consider the possibility of rehabilitation, to see a man shaped and ultimately shattered by forces beyond his immediate control. Linda, Olivia's mother, addressed the court with tremulous resolve. Her victim impact statement drew tears from the gallery and silenced even the most jaded spectators. Linda spoke not only of her grief at losing her daughter, but of the countless small joys now stolen from her family, the empty chair at birthday tables, the silent holidays, Ethan's recurring nightmares, and the wakeful nights spent turning over every moment that led to this point. In her words, Olivia emerged as a living person, not a case file, a child who loved dinosaurs and storybooks, who looked after her brother and believed the best in people until the end. Linda wrestled aloud with the question of forgiveness. I don't know that I ever can, but I also don't know that I can survive if I don't at least try. I have to try for my son, for myself, for the memory of my beautiful girl. The courtroom sat in reverent silence after she spoke. The judge's words, when they finally came, struck a careful balance between the calls for justice and the realities of human imperfection. Aware of the community's anger and the national spotlight on the case, the judge acknowledged the gravity of Mark's crime and the irreparable consequences for Olivia's family. He also recognized Mark's mental health history, referencing expert testimony and the institutional failings that left so many families at risk. Ultimately, the sentence was severe: life imprisonment with no parole for the murder of a child, and additional years for related charges. The gavel's echo left no ambiguity. This was the state's strongest condemnation, and for some in the courthouse, it finally felt like closure. But punishment, no matter how swift or harsh, cannot undo tragedy. The months following the trial saw Olivia's neighborhood struggle with ripples of grief, outrage, and doubt. Parents became more vigilant, locking doors and checking in with their children more frequently. Community support groups flourished, while others quietly fell apart under the pressure of constant reminders. At Olivia's school, counselors spent extra hours with students who had known her, and by extension had brushed up against death and betrayal in the most visceral way. Ethan, her little brother, remained withdrawn for many months, speaking little and sleeping poorly, his favorite sister, now a presence only in old drawings and fleeting dreams. The broader public impact was equally complex. Newspapers and television anchors debated at length, was Mark's sentence just? Had social services, the schools, and the larger safety net failed to recognize danger lurking inside the home? Activists organized rallies for increased funding for child mental health programs and reforms in the foster system, and blended family background checks. Politicians visited the neighborhood promising legislative reviews, But as the months became years, many families were left to build their own networks of trust. A grassroots web of babysitting swaps, neighborhood watch apps, and quiet signals exchanged between parents at playgrounds. Linda's path through the aftermath was especially harrowing. At first, she struggled against both public scrutiny and private guilt, tormented by questions of whether she could have seen the signs, whether the outcome would have been different if she'd made a single different decision. Therapy, church, and close friendships became her lifeline. She joined support circles for grieving parents, sometimes sitting silent through meetings, other times volunteering to speak about Olivia's story as a warning and a hope. Gradually, Linda turned her pain toward activism. She attended city council meetings, partnered with nonprofits, and became, unwittingly, a public face for child victim advocacy in New York. Her advocacy, driven by raw experience, pushed for mandatory parental and step-parent screenings, community education, and crisis intervention resources in schools. Yet, the weight of loss was always present. Anniversaries of Olivia's death became occasions for candlelight vigils and balloon releases, as the neighborhood gathered to remember and demand further action. Local artists painted murals of Olivia, her gentle smile peering over the playground where her laughter once rang. Coverage of the case became compulsory reading in criminal justice and social work courses at colleges across the city, cited as both a cautionary tale and a call for reform. Some older neighbors confessed to still feeling unsettled, reporting that even routine sights, an empty swing, a girl's backpack left behind, would bring back the ache of loss anew. The case's aftermath revealed the many cracks in systems designed to keep children safe. Investigations into the local Department of Social Services uncovered a backlog of cases, staffing shortages, and inconsistent application of protective measures for blended families. News exposes highlighted regional disparities in mental health support and the lack of anonymous hotlines or emergency resources for families in crisis. While some reforms were gradual, additional training for social workers, new protocols for reporting concerns, many families and advocates felt progress lagged behind the urgency exposed by Olivia's tragedy. For Mark, prison would be a lonely reckoning, his name whispered in infamy among both inmates and guards. He became the subject of true crime podcasts and magazine features, a cautionary tale of what can fester under the veneer of normalcy. Letters occasionally arrived, some from people expressing anger or wishing him harm, others from strangers who were moved by his story, and lamented a system that seemed unable to reach men like him before it was too late. Mark's own attempts at therapy and reflection, as reported by his lawyer, were ongoing but uncertain. Redemption, if possible, an uncertain path stretching far beyond the courtroom. Most searing, perhaps, was the undeniability that Olivia's life, and her unbearable death, could never be made sense of by any verdict or public policy. For her family, the sentence marked a line in the sand, the official end to their search for answers, but not the conclusion of their pain. The empty room, the quiet apartment, the forever altered routines, these remained stubborn reminders of what was taken. Yet within that pain, a sliver of hope persisted, that through collective memory, community resolve, and systemic change, Olivia would not be lost to time, but would instead inspire the kind of vigilance and compassion that might save another child, another family, from enduring the same heartbreak. Farewell, and messages. Saying goodbye after a difficult journey like this is never easy, and as I sit with you at the end of this heartbreaking story, I can't help but feel a lingering ache for the characters, the real families, and every listener or reader who has taken this emotional walk alongside me. If you've made it this far, it means something in this tragedy has resonated with the spaces in your own life where vulnerability, injustice, or that universal longing for safety flickers. True crime is never just entertainment, not when it draws on the raw, unhealed wounds of communities, and not when it dares us to hold a mirror up to our society's deepest failings. First and foremost, I want to thank each of you for not flinching, for allowing yourselves to confront these uncomfortable truths. This is a story no parent wants to imagine, no child should ever endure, and yet it is one that needs to be told, retold, and learned from. In the storm of headlines and social media firestorms, real lives and real pain so easily become footnotes. Taking the time to look deeper, to see beyond the mugshots and court sketches, is an act of respect and remembrance. As I reflect on everything we've just shared, Olivia's innocence, her family's strength and heartbreak, the community's outcry, and the slow wheels of justice, I'm left with the belief that these tragedies are not isolated. They are ripple effects that reach far beyond a single apartment block, a single courtroom, or a single headline. If there's one plea I could leave you with, it's this: don't let your sorrow or anger fade with the end of this episode. Let it become a call to vigilance in your own circles. Pay attention to those small warning signs or cries for help that sometimes get drowned out by the ordinary chaos of life. If a neighbor's child seems withdrawn, if a mother looks unusually exhausted or anxious, or if a family's daily rhythm abruptly changes, notice, speak up, offer an ear, extend a hand. Tragedy thrives in silence and in the cracks of communities where watchdogs become too tired, too distracted, or too numb to act. Real change, the kind that protects future Olivias, begins at the kitchen table, in school hallways, and with the kinds of conversations we're forced to have, however painful. It's tempting after stories like this to seek comfort in blame, to load the weight entirely onto broken systems, failed safeguards, or individuals who shattered trust. But collective accountability, the honest admission that change is everyone's job, this is what makes communities safer in the long run. You don't have to be a police officer, a judge, a social worker, or a politician to make a difference. Sometimes it's enough to simply care and to carry forward the memory of those lost as a reason to do better. I hope Olivia's story lingers, not as another case file or cautionary tale, but as a catalyst for kindness, responsibility, and a firmer commitment to every child's right to safety and love. If just one person listening feels inspired to reach out, check in, or fight harder for a vulnerable neighbor, then her legacy continues, not in sorrow, but in solidarity. Thank you for walking through the pain, the anger, and the difficult truths with me. Thank you for caring enough to listen, and for being willing to carry these lessons out into the world. Together we can mourn the unimaginable, and do our part to make sure such stories grow rarer, not more common. Until next time, take care of yourselves, your loved ones, and those unseen faces who quietly depend on the vigilance and compassion of their communities. May Olivia's memory shine a light on the shadows, and may the work of healing and change continue long after the headlines fade. Goodbye for now, and may you always stand courageously on the side of hope and justice.